When Sarah Martin, 28 years old, a single mother with a 3-month-old baby in her arms, walked into Foster's Auto Repair in Chicago, clutching the keys to a 1998 Honda Civic that barely ran, the last thing she owned from her deceased father, asking how much they could give her for that wreck, no one imagined what would happen next. Her hands trembled as she explained she needed money immediately, that the hospital bills after her complicated delivery were suffocating her, that her landlord had threatened eviction. Michael Foster, the 35-year-old owner of the garage, looked into her eyes and saw something that struck him straight in the heart. Not the desperation he expected, but a silent dignity, a strength that persisted despite everything. What Sarah didn't know was that this man in work overalls, with grease-stained hands, was hiding a personal story that would transform her random gesture into something that would change both their lives forever. Because sometimes the universe puts the right people in the right place at the right time. And that November morning in Chicago was about to prove that miracles still exist, even in the humblest garages. If you're ready for this story, write in the comments where you're watching this video from. Foster's Auto Repair was located on Milwaukee Avenue, in a Chicago neighborhood where downtown elegance gave way to working-class Chicago, the one of immigrants and families fighting every day to make ends meet. It was a garage like many others, with half-rusted shutters, the smell of gasoline and motor oil permeating the air, the floor stained by decades of work. Michael Foster had inherited this business from his father 10 years earlier, when he was only 25 and had no desire to spend his life under cars. He had studied mechanical engineering at community college, dreamed of working for a luxury car manufacturer, designing engines that would make enthusiasts' hearts race worldwide. But life had other plans. His father had died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving him alone with his sick mother and a garage full of debts. Michael had abandoned his dreams and rolled up his sleeves, working 16 hours a day to save the family business and take care of his mother until she, too, passed away 3 years later. Now the garage was thriving, known in the neighborhood for honest prices and quality work. Michael had 6 employees, all neighborhood kids he'd trained personally. But that November morning, cold and gray as only Chicago can be in fall, when Sarah Martin crossed the garage threshold with a bundle in her arms, Michael felt something shift inside him. She was a young woman, around 28, with brown hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, dark eyes circled with exhaustion, a worn blue coat that had seen better days. The newborn in her arms slept wrapped in a light blue blanket that seemed the only new thing they owned. She had that look typical of new mothers who haven't slept in months, but there was something more. A tension, a restrained desperation that showed through her every gesture. She had stopped at the garage entrance as if she needed to gather courage before entering completely. Michael was finishing checking the brakes on a Volkswagen Jetta when he noticed her. He wiped his hands on a rag and approached her with a professional smile, the one he reserved for all customers. Sarah had spoken in a low but firm voice. She said she needed to sell her car, a 1998 Honda Civic parked outside. She asked how much they could give her. Any amount would do. She needed money right away. Michael went outside to look at the car. It was exactly what he expected. A wreck on 4 wheels. The body was full of scratches and dents. The front bumper was held together with duct tape. The tires were so worn it was a miracle the car was still on the road. He tried to start it and the engine coughed like an old man with asthma before starting, emitting worrying black smoke. He went back inside, shaking his head. Under normal conditions, that car was worth maybe $300, and only for spare parts. But when he saw Sarah's eyes, that desperate hope mixed with shame, something tightened in his chest. Sarah had anticipated his answer. She said she knew the car was worthless. But it was all she had. It had belonged to her father. He died 2 years ago and left it to her. She'd tried to sell it online, but no one was interested. She needed to pay hospital bills. The delivery had been complicated. She'd had to stay hospitalized 3 weeks. Insurance didn't cover everything. She had $3,000 in debt, and the landlord was threatening eviction if she didn't pay rent arrears. Michael listened in silence, noticing how she held the baby, how she instinctively protected him with her body, how she tried to maintain dignity despite everything. Sarah wasn't crying, wasn't begging. She was simply stating facts with a calm that hid an ocean of pain. Then she added something that struck Michael more than anything else. She said she didn't want charity, she just wanted an honest price for the car. She knew it wasn't worth much, but hoped it would be enough for at least part of the debts. Her father cared about that car, washed it every Sunday, even when he could barely walk. If she had to sell it, she wanted it to go to someone who would treat it with respect. Michael looked outside again at that beat-up Civic and then looked at Sarah. In that moment, he made a decision that would change everything. He said the car needed a lot of work, but he saw potential. He could offer her $4,000, but with one condition. She had to give him 2 weeks to arrange some paperwork with the bank. Sarah's eyes widened. $4,000 was more than double what she hoped for. She asked if he was joking, if he was sure. Michael nodded seriously, explaining that his father always said Civics of that generation were practically indestructible, that with the right repairs he could resell it well. Sarah had accepted, almost trembling. She said she could wait 2 weeks. It gave her a margin to breathe. Michael asked where she lived, said he'd send someone to pick up the car the next day. There was no need for her to bring it back. When Sarah left, holding the baby against her chest and with tears finally free to fall, Michael stood watching her walk away down Milwaukee Avenue. His mechanics looked at him confused. They all knew that car wasn't worth even half of what he'd offered. Jake, the oldest of his employees, approached and asked if he was sure about what he was doing. Michael simply replied that his father had taught him that sometimes the value of things isn't measured in money. Then he went back under the Volkswagen, but his thoughts were already elsewhere. That evening, Michael stayed alone in the garage, sitting in his small, cluttered office. Sarah's Civic was parked in the back lot. He looked at it through the dirty window, and memories overwhelmed him. 23 years earlier, he was 8, and his mother, Anne, was pregnant. Times were hard. His father, Joseph, worked at the garage, but business wasn't good. They lived in a 2-room apartment above the garage, paint peeling from walls, winters so cold they all slept together in the double bed. One December night, his mother had pregnancy complications. Joseph had no money for an ambulance, loaded her in the car and drove to the hospital. They saved Anne, but lost the baby. Medical expenses were devastating. For months, they lived on minimum. Joseph worked day and night. Anne took 3 part-time jobs, cleaned houses, ironed for neighbors. Michael remembered the shame of torn shoes, refused field trips, his mother crying secretly. But he also remembered the dignity. They never asked for charity, never gave up. It took years, but Joseph grew the garage, built a reputation for honesty. They reached decent stability. Then Michael was 25, studying at college thanks to his parents' sacrifices. And Joseph died. Heart attack under a car. He discovered the garage was full of debts his father had taken on to send him to college. He left school, took over the business, worked to exhaustion. His mother died 3 years later, heartbroken. Now he was 35, prosperous garage, savings in the bank, but alone. Never married, no children, focused only on work. When he'd seen Sarah that morning, with the baby and that dignified desperation, he'd seen his mother. $4,000 was nothing to him. For Sarah, it meant the difference between a roof or the street. But as he looked at that Civic in the lot, an idea began forming. An idea that went beyond $4,000. An idea that perhaps could give meaning to all his parents' sacrifices. The following days, Michael couldn't get Sarah out of his head. He found himself wondering how she was doing, if the baby was okay, if she was managing with what little money she probably had. He'd seen her once for less than 10 minutes, yet that silent and proud woman had carved a hole in the wall he'd built around his heart. On the 5th day after their meeting, Michael did something he normally never did. He closed the garage early, told Jake to handle everything, and went to the address Sarah had left for the car pickup. The building was exactly as he expected. A low-income housing complex on the south side, peeling plaster, cracked windows, graffiti on walls. He climbed stairs to the 3rd floor, smell of cooking and dampness filling his nostrils. In front of door number 312, he hesitated. What was he doing? Why was he here? Before he could decide whether to knock or leave, the door opened. Sarah appeared with the baby in her arms, tired eyes but surprised to see him. For a moment they both stood in silence. Michael cleared his throat and said he'd stopped by to check some things about the car, documents he needed. Sarah opened the door to let him in. The apartment was tiny, a studio where bed, kitchen and couch existed in the same suffocating space. But it was clean, organized with a care that spoke of pride despite poverty. There was a small crib near the bed, handmade and painted light blue. On the walls, faded photos of an elderly man who must be Sarah's father, his smile captured in happier moments. Sarah offered him coffee, and Michael accepted more out of politeness than real desire. While she prepared coffee with an old machine that had seen better days, Michael looked around trying to better understand who this woman was. On the table, he saw piles of bills, all stamped in red "Final Notice." He saw a hospital booklet with figures that made him shudder. He also saw books, many books, stacked in every available corner. Classics of American literature, poetry, foreign novels. One was open on the nightstand. 100 Years of Solitude by Garcia Marquez, with margin notes. Sarah returned with 2 tiny cups of strong coffee. They sat facing each other at the small wooden table, the baby now awake, looking at her with those huge eyes only newborns have.
This story hit you, didn't it? Tap that little like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. All right, let's keep going.
Michael asked what the baby's name was. Sarah replied his name was Tommy, after her father Thomas. He was 3.5 months old, and was the most beautiful thing that had ever happened to her, even though times were hard. Then, slowly, Sarah began to tell. Not because Michael had asked, but as if she needed to say these things aloud, as if keeping them inside had suffocated her too long. She said her father Thomas had been a factory worker in Gary, Indiana for 40 years, a simple man who loved books and taught her to read before she even went to school. Her mother died when Sarah was 10, sudden cancer. Her father raised her alone, sacrificing everything for her. Sarah had studied literature at community college, working nights as a waitress to pay for studies. She'd graduated with honors, but never found stable work in her field. She'd done substitute teaching in schools, precarious jobs, always on the edge of poverty, but somehow getting by. Then she'd met Andrew, a fellow teacher. They fell in love quickly, too quickly as she understood later. When she told him she was pregnant, Andrew disappeared. Literally. Stopped answering the phone, moved to another city, blocked her everywhere. Sarah faced pregnancy alone. Her father was still alive then, was her lifeline. But 2 months before Tommy was born, her father had a stroke and died in his sleep. Sarah was left completely alone, pregnant and without steady work. Delivery was complicated, severe preeclampsia, emergency C-section needed, and weeks of hospitalization. Bills piled up like an avalanche. Now she lived on what she could scrape together with freelance translations, working from her laptop when Tommy slept. But it wasn't enough. Never enough. The landlord wanted $800 in arrears plus current month, or she had to leave within 2 weeks. As she spoke, Sarah kept her eyes down, shame coloring her cheeks. Michael listened in silence, his heart tightening more and more. He saw in her so much of his mother, so much of the struggle he himself had faced. When Sarah finished talking, for a long moment there was only silence. Then Michael told her something that would surprise her. He asked if she'd ever thought about going back to teaching. Sarah laughed bitterly. She said she'd love to, but there were no permanent positions, only occasional substitutes that paid misery. And now, with Tommy, she couldn't afford to leave him with someone. Daycare cost as much as rent. Michael nodded thoughtfully. Then he got up, said he had to go, but would call her soon about the car. Before leaving, he turned and told her something she didn't understand right away. He told her not to lose hope, that sometimes the universe had strange ways of fixing things. When Michael returned to the garage, his decision was made. He called Jake into his office and explained a plan that would make him seem crazy. But Jake, who'd known Michael for 20 years, who'd seen how much he'd changed after his parents' deaths, smiled and said it was time the boss did something for himself, even if disguised as help for someone else. The 2 weeks were up, and Sarah arrived at the garage with Tommy, heart pounding. Those $4,000 meant salvation. But when she entered, Michael wasn't alone. There were 4 people. Rebecca Collins, owner of a publishing house, Uncle Robert Foster, Michael's uncle and property owner, and Laura and Stephen Martinez, young parents like her. Michael made introductions, then explained what he'd done. He'd fixed the Civic, it worked, but the car wasn't worth $4,000, they both knew that, and he didn't do disguised charity. Instead, he'd arranged something else. Rebecca had a position for part-time translator working from home, $1,200 a month. Robert had a 2-bedroom available, $650 instead of $900, first 2 months free. Laura and Stephen could coordinate as mutual babysitters. Sarah listened as if in a trance, tears streaming down her face. She asked why, what he wanted in return. Michael sat facing her. He told about his father Joseph and mother Anne, cold nights and dignity and poverty, the brother never born and hospital bills. No one had helped them then. He said he couldn't change the past, but could honor his parents by helping someone who was where they had been. And yes, he wanted something in return. He wanted Sarah to promise that when someday she was in a position to help someone, she'd do it. To pass forward the kindness, that her father Thomas's love would live through her actions. Rebecca gave her a contract. Robert gave her keys, Laura and Stephen their numbers, and Michael returned with an envelope, $2,000 for immediate bills. She could return it when she could, or never. Sarah broke down crying like she hadn't since her father's death. She said thank you, again and again, like a prayer. That evening she left the garage with much more than money. She left with hope, with a future, with proof that goodness still existed in the world. The following months changed everything. Sarah moved into Robert's apartment, bright with a room for Tommy. She slept well for the first time in years. Work with Rebecca was perfect. She translated novels and poetry she loved. Friendship with Laura and Stephen became precious. They alternated with kids and supported each other. Sarah finally had family. She paid bills gradually, rebuilt credit, saved for Tommy. The restored Civic worked magnificently. But the most unexpected part involved Michael. He stopped by often with various excuses. Check the car, bring a book, see Tommy. Sarah invited him for dinner, simple pasta dishes shared with joy. They talked for hours. Something grew between them, a deep connection between souls who'd known loss and struggle. 6 months after their first meeting, one spring evening, Michael arrived with something different in his eyes. Tommy was asleep. They sat on the balcony, Chicago lights shining like fallen stars. Michael spoke first. He said since meeting her, something had changed. He'd spent 10 years building walls, focusing only on work. But she'd shown him it wasn't enough. He'd fallen in love with her strength, dignity, how she loved Tommy, the woman who hadn't given up. Sarah felt different tears falling. She said she'd feared it was just gratitude. But every time he left, the apartment seemed empty. Every time he held Tommy and the baby laughed, her heart swelled. She felt seen like never before. She said she'd fallen in love too. Michael kissed her for the first time, sweet and cautious, full of promises. When they separated, they were both crying and smiling together. 3 years later, Foster's Auto Repair had a new look. Michael had expanded the business, hired more staff, opened a second location, but most important was the new sign on the door. Joseph and Ann Foundation, Solidarity Repairs. Michael had transformed part of the garage into a non-profit project. He repaired cars for free for people in difficulty, single mothers, poor families, anyone who needed transportation to work but had no money for repairs. He financed the project with profits from the main garage and donations from customers who'd heard the story. Sarah still worked as a translator, but now was also a volunteer at the foundation, managing administrative paperwork and coordinating with social services to identify families most in need. She'd also started teaching English to immigrant children in the neighborhood, free lessons held on weekends in the closed garage. Tommy was 3.5, a lively child who'd called Michael Daddy since he started talking. Michael had legally adopted him 6 months earlier after he and Sarah married in a simple ceremony in the garage itself, surrounded by friends, employees, and families they'd helped. Sarah was also pregnant again, expecting a girl they'd name Anne in honor of Michael's mother. But the most beautiful story was that of a young woman who'd entered the garage one Tuesday morning in November, exactly 4 years after Sarah had crossed that same threshold. The woman's name was Jessica, 25, with a 1-year-old baby. She'd just escaped a violent relationship and desperately needed to repair her old car to get to work in a different city where she'd found safe refuge. Sarah had met her at the foundation reception. She'd seen in those eyes the same desperation she herself had felt, the same shame in asking for help. And in that moment, she understood the circle was closing. They not only repaired Jessica's car for free, but Sarah used her network of contacts to find her a job, safe apartment, psychological support. They did exactly what Michael had done for her, passing forward that kindness as he'd asked her to do. When Jessica left the garage that day with tears of gratitude in her eyes, Sarah hugged Michael tight. She told him now she truly understood why he'd done what he'd done. It hadn't been just to help her. It had been to start a chain of goodness that would never break. Michael kissed her and told her his father always said a man's legacy isn't measured in what he leaves, but in what he inspires in others. Joseph and Ann hadn't left money, but had left the example of how to live with dignity and kindness. And now that lesson continued, multiplying through every person they helped. That evening, as they closed the garage, Tommy running ahead laughing and Sarah holding Michael's hand with the other resting on her belly where little Anne grew, Michael stopped a moment to look at the foundation sign. He whispered thanks to the sky, to his parents, to the universe that had put Sarah in his path, because she hadn't only saved herself that November morning 4 years earlier, when she'd entered desperate with a car worth nothing. She'd saved him too, given him back a purpose, shown him how to transform pain into love. Sometimes miracles don't come from heaven with trumpets and lights. Sometimes they arrive through a garage door, carrying a baby and clutching keys to a 1998 Honda Civic. And sometimes, if we're brave enough to open our hearts, those miracles change the world one kind gesture at a time. If this story made you believe that kindness can still change the world, leave a little heart below to let me know. And if you really want to support stories like this, that talk about real people with real hearts in a world that often forgets what truly matters, you can leave a small thanks from the heart using the Super Thanks feature below. Every gesture counts, just like Michael's when he saw Sarah and decided to make a difference. Because you chose to stay until the end, and that makes you as special as the protagonists of this story.